Welcome back to Close Up. What better way to celebrate the Independence Day holiday than with some fireworks? On this program, that means a little back and forth, and youth will be served, as we have with us today Lucas Meyer from the New Hampshire Young Democrats and State Representative Joe Alexander of Goffstown representing the New Hampshire Young Republicans. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Representative, let's start with you. The budget impasse at the State House is a big story. Who's to blame?
I'm not in the habit of throwing fingers at anybody, but I do want to say the reasons why I voted against the committee of conference budget. It has a $93 million structural deficit. It increases spending by 13%. And there's a couple revenue estimates that are off place on behalf of the committee of conference. So, for example, the committee of conference raised tobacco age to 21, but did not reevaluate the revenue estimates with the lost revenue due to decreased sales.
What about you, Lucas? Is there a place here where you feel someone's more responsible than someone else?
Yeah, I think it's pretty upsetting that the budget was vetoed. I think there was a lot of bipartisan agreement in what was in the budget. I think you look at the largest increase in education funding in 2 decades. Our state's in a crisis when it comes to public education. We have schools in Berlin and Franklin that are struggling to get by. And this budget would have done a lot of good for those communities. But a simple inability to find compromise and the inability of the Republican Party to negotiate and to come to the table is the reason why we do not have a budget today. You look at the priorities. Budget's about priorities. In the House, the Democratic priority of a capital gains tax was pulled out. In the Senate, paid family leave was pulled out. When you came to the governor to negotiate, the business taxes would not come out. You know, we've had decreases on our business taxes 2 out of the past 3 years. We now have the most friendly business tax climate in New England. But because of the inability to negotiate and to compromise, because this was a compromised budget, I think Joe would probably agree with me that 90% of what's in that budget, everyone agrees on. And I think it's particularly reckless at this time in our state's history, what's happening with DCYF, what's happening with our public schools, what's happening with access to women's health care. Let's not forget, in this budget, there was money to backstop against the lack of funds that are coming into the state as a result of the gag rule from the Trump administration. So there was a lot of good in this budget, but the inability to get past or to negotiate and really sink this budget because of tax breaks to big out-of-state companies, I think it's pretty disappointing. I think the people of New Hampshire are pretty disappointed by it.
Representative, did the governor not compromise enough?
The tax breaks for the out-of-state companies is a very great talking point for the other side. I do want to argue, though, that this new budget, we did give up some things. So we gave up $63 million in school building aid, which is targeted to property-poor school districts. We gave up $32 million in student debt relief. We gave up $24 million in university aid. So there are some things that the governor gave up in the budget. And I do also want the record to reflect that 100% of House Republicans and Senate Republicans voted against the budget, and Democrats voted against the budget as well. So that was a bipartisan opposition to the budget. So I would argue that not only was it a bipartisan opposition to the budget, but not a single House Republican was asked to be a part of the committee conference, and they were added in at the last minute instead of added in right ahead of time, which is customary of the other side.
Well, Lucas, really quick here, business taxes have gone, the cuts have gone into effect now. So what's the deal now? Where do Democrats draw a line when that's already taken place?
I mean, I think there's still a lot to be played out. And to Joe's point about the structural deficit, I mean, it is state law that we have to have a balanced budget. We had, I think what Joe neglected to mention is $110 million in capital fund projects. Also, the budget that was passed by the House and the Senate added money to the rainy day fund, added money to the education fund. So this was a structurally sound budget. And I think, again, at a time when there are a lot of people hurting in this state, to just go into a continuing resolution, which actually is going to hurt more of our public schools. You're going to see slashes in funding to schools in Franklin. Franklin let go of 10 teachers. They had a science teacher, elementary school teacher. And now that we do not have a budget, they do not know what they're going to do come the fall. That uncertainty, whether it's in public education, women's access to health care at our women's health centers, is really unsettling for the state and something that could have been avoided.
We'll see what kind of deal comes out of eventually. Let's shift to 2020. The Democrats have had the mic for a while, so Representative Alexander, what's the Republican perspective on how this Democratic primary is going right now?
I love seeing it happen. I enjoyed watching both the debates. I thought they were very interesting. I thought they were very showing about what the issues are going to be in 2020. I'm confident with a lot of the rhetoric that's happening on the stage that Republicans are going to do very well in 2020. Just some basic key questions about Medicare for all and Medicaid or Medicare for undocumented immigrants. There's a lot of things that I feel like Republicans are winning on the issues. So I look forward to 2020, actually.
Lucas, Democrats moving too far to the left here?
No, look, I think with Joe and I here, I think it's important to talk about how young people are approaching this primary. And I think from the Democratic point of view, this has been a really encouraging primary for young people. We're seeing all the candidates take the issues most important to young people to the top of their platforms, whether that's college affordability, whether that's climate change, which we do not hear enough about even in our own debates, or, excuse me, voting rights. You see it across the board. Young people, I mean, you've been to a lot of these events. Joe's seen them on social media. They're full of people. There is a level of engagement among young people in the state that we haven't seen in a long time. And so for the New Hampshire Young Democrats, we're seeing this as a huge opportunity to bring more people into our organization, continue to train activists. I mean, I think in the past 2 years, we've held 250 events. We've trained 7,000 activists, in large part because folks with the incredible diversity we have in our field, coming into the party and wanting to get engaged, and then trying to focus them not only on these national issues, but also what's happening in the State House and making sure we take these larger, the Green New Deal. Let's condense that to the state level. Let's talk about net metering. Let's talk about the veto of HB 365, a bill that would have raised our net metering cap and helped expand solar in New Hampshire. So I think it's a really exciting time to organize young people in the state. And I know as we go through the summer, it's only going to get more busy.
Representative, President Trump has energized Democrats to try and take back the White House. Do you find it's a tough sell with young people, trying to get them excited about voting for President Trump?
I mean, I look at myself. I mean, I voted for President Trump in 2016 because I knew he would foster an economy that works for everyone. It works for young people. It promotes a friendly business environment. It's part of the reasons why we can say that New Hampshire is one of the #1 states for opportunity. So I supported Trump for a lot of those reasons. I supported Trump because he promised to keep taxes low. He actually cut more taxes than any president in recent history. So I support him for all those reasons, and I look forward to supporting him again in 2020.
Some of the president's closest associates here in New Hampshire have mentioned that they feel his chances here are better in 2020 in terms of winning the general election here and the popular vote due to some of the voting laws that have gone into place. Lucas, this is a big point for you guys that you've been working on. What will be the impact, do you believe, of some of these campus-targeted voting measures?
I think that's still to be determined. We had SB 3, which changed some of our same-day voter registration laws, which was actually struck down by a Superior Court judge last year, saying some of it would be, some of the burdens would be unconstitutional on voters. That'll then go to a full trial at the end of the summer, so that's still to be determined as the impact. That has been in effect, so we have been educating and preparing students for what those changes are going to be, making sure they understand their constitutionally protected right to vote. And then we have HB 1264, which I think went into effect on Monday, which deals with, again, changing definitions of what, or not changing definitions, but adding additional burdens to our registration process by requiring students who do not have a New Hampshire driver's license or do not have their car registered in New Hampshire to go out and pay the state a fee after they vote. We see these as unconstitutional. We don't see the need for these. We really saw all of these laws born out of the Trump myth of rampant voter fraud in New Hampshire. There aren't buses coming across the border. There is not rampant voter fraud in New Hampshire. You do not hear from local election officials clamoring for these changes. In our opinion, they are insidious. They are targeted at student voters. You have Bill O'Brien, who's going to be running for U.S. Senate, who in 2010 or 2011 said he just didn't want college students to vote because he didn't like how they thought or how they think. So I think you see time and again, session after session, these attempts to restrict access to the ballot box, while, our friends on the side of the aisle, the 32 young Dems we have in the House, which we're very proud of, the 2 young Dems we have in the Senate, folks like Chairwoman LaVeck in the Senate Election Law Committee. We're focused on how do we add actual integrity to our system? How do we modernize our system? Can we do online voter registration? Can we do automatic voter registration? I think these are the conversations we should be having, and not targeting student voters to come into this, who want to stay in the state.
Representative, Republicans get kind of ticked off when this is referred to as voter suppression. Why is that?
Well, we have to look at what are the requirements for voting. Number 1, you have to be 18 years of age or older. Number 2, you have to be a U.S. citizen. Number 3, you have to live in the state that you are voting in. So these laws that were passed were to protect the reasons why you're able to vote. So what I would say is, like, we have attempts this term to repeal that legislation through HB 103 and 104. And what I can say about it is I didn't vote for the bills last session because I wasn't a representative, but I definitely would have, and I would have supported them. But this term I voted against those 2 bills because they sought to repeal legislation that we had just enacted last term. I do know the governor's not in the habit of repealing bills that he just signed into law. So we'll see how things go. But as of right now, if you're 18 years of age, you're a resident of the state, and you're a resident of the United States, you should be able to vote, and there's no reason why we'll stop you from that.
Gentlemen, we'd love to keep talking, but we've hit the limit here. I'm sure we will see you in the future.
Thanks, Adam.
We appreciate your time.